C'est-à-dire qu'on a le plaisir de présenter cet ouvrage qui a été dirigé par Gabriel Racca et Chris Hughes, et qui est un ouvrage que je trouve important, qui donne beaucoup d'éléments de réflexion, qui nous dit beaucoup de choses nouvelles. Je crois que c'est la manière la plus correcte de décrire cet ouvrage. C'est un ouvrage qui nous dit des choses nouvelles. Alors, le titre, comme vous avez vu, c'est Integrity and Efficiency in Sustainable Public Contracts. Et bon, on va le présenter aujourd'hui. On a le plaisir d'avoir Jeremy McCrary, which is a Public Procurement Policy Analyst in OECD. Merci d'être là, d'avoir accepté d'intervenir aujourd'hui à cette présentation. Ensuite, on aura de présentation de Laurence Labiofolio et de notre ami qui nous a rejoint pour Linière du cabinet Linklaters Paris. Et ensuite, je vais aussi dire quelque chose à propos de cet ouvrage qui, comme j'ai déjà dit, c'est un ouvrage important. Donc, j'ai aussi le plaisir de souligner certains aspects qui me sont semblés particulièrement importants, particulièrement intéressants. Alors, on ne peut pas perdre de temps parce qu'il y a beaucoup de choses à dire. Et alors, je donne la parole de suite à M. McCrary, just to introduce this presentation today.
Thank you. I first want to start with providing the apologies of Janos Bertok, who is the head of our division. He was very sorry he would not be able to make it today. He was called into a sort of last-minute meeting with our Secretary General. I'm apologizing not only because you will be deprived of his experience and insights, but also because you will be deprived of his ability to speak French. I unfortunately do not share that gift yet. So, as mentioned, I will start with a sort of brief introduction to this topic and the work that the OECD does in the public procurement space. The OECD work is currently based on a 2008 recommendation of our Council on Enhancing Integrity in Public Procurement. In the course of sort of implementing that product, we conduct peer reviews with member countries, including the US and Mexico, and partner countries like Colombia. We have pulled together an international community of practice, leading practitioners on public procurements, and we've done some work with the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group in putting together a compendium of good practices in public procurement. And I introduce all of that merely to lead into our chapter in the book, which presents a series of lessons that we've learned since the introduction of our 2008 recommendation. Some areas where there's been successful implementation of those principles, but primarily also some areas where work remains to be done. And so that's what I'll provide today as a means of introducing and also the ongoing work. So in the book, you will see in our chapter that there's focus still, as was mentioned in the previous sessions, also in the material that's provided, work necessary to do a better job of preparing to award contracts, the work that leads into correctly identifying the requirements, finding the right sources, and awarding correctly. And also more need to focus on management of contracts once they are awarded. There are opportunities still for corruption that follow that could be better addressed. In many procurement systems, there is so much of a focus on making sure the award is done properly, and that's certainly an important element. And the earlier presentations, I believe, focused on some of those legal concerns around the complaint systems and remedies. But getting the preparation and then the management right, we found to be important areas that are often overlooked in the implementation of procurement systems. In most of our member countries and in many other countries that we work with, there's also still a need to further develop the capacity of the procurement officials. So making sure that there's both capacity in terms of number of people to manage the system, but also then in terms of the skills that they have and the treatment of procurement as a profession and as an important function and not merely an administrative one is another element that we've seen over time as a continuous need for improvement. Finally, as we've looked more in detail at the function of systems, both sort of federal systems like the US or Swiss systems, and also systems that are more centralized but still conduct procurement through a number of offices, we need to find a way to be more customer focused and more efficient by reducing duplication. Those kinds of wasteful efforts has been another area that we've seen as an area of focus. So on the basis of all of this, and as mentioned at the very end of our sort of brief chapter in the book, we are now developing a new draft recommendation on public procurement. This was shared for public comments between September and October of this year. It has since been revised and approved by our Public Governance Committee for submission to the OECD Council, and we hope to have an adopted new recommendation early next year, which will form the basis for our ongoing work. And it's sort of those changes over time that I want to conclude with. I intend to speak very briefly as an introduction, but whereas the 2008 recommendation was actually titled Enhancing Integrity in Public Procurement, and centered around 4 pillars. Those pillars included a number of elements of good management as well, and oversight, because in procurement, this is an area where the interaction between the public and private spheres is the central part of the function. It's an area where huge amounts of money are concentrated. It's an area that the public sees as an issue of trust. It's an area that directly affects delivery to services for citizens. So for all of these reasons, improving the system, the public procurement system, in any element is a way to improve integrity in the public procurement system. And we can focus on specific issues of integrity, but making sure that the system is better managed, making sure that it's better run, making sure that waste is driven out, making sure that risks are addressed, whether they be risks of fraud or simply risks of mistakes. These all contribute to citizen perceptions of integrity of the system, to better functioning and better use of taxpayer money. And so one of the things we've learned is that as we move from 4 pillars in our earlier recommendation to 12 elements, 12 recommendations in the new one, is that these are really all reinforcing. We have sort of thematic recommendations on integrity and transparency. We have more practical ones related to e-procurements or collecting data to do evaluation. But all of these recommendations really do support each other, and implementing them effectively yields a system that's much greater than the sum of these parts. So with that, as a simple introduction, I would like to pass the floor back over, and I'd be happy to participate in the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I want to present some parts of the book. We have divided the work among us, and so I'm in charge of the main topic. I mean, the first part of the book, second part, and then the fourth part. Okay, and third and fifth is not mine. But actually, what I want to begin with is general presentation about the topic of the book, and it was recalled by Jean-Bernard in his foreword of the beginning of the book, that the idea of this book actually emerged during a workshop of this public contract network in Torino in June 2012, and that meeting, and then the following in December 2012 as well, focused on the odious relation which too often exists between public spending and corruption. And as a starting point in the first article, which was written by Gabriela and Chris, actually they quote, or they start with the article written by Stephen Schooner on Desiderata for functioning public procurement system. And with this article, I think Stephen Schooner gave a list of the goals that have to be achieved by a functioning public procurement system, and we can enlarge the scope to the public contract system as well. It's not only for public procurement contract. And so in his presentation, Schooner lists, for example, competition, transparency, integrity as the main goals that have to be achieved by a functioning system. So all these principles are necessary, but and should be enforced, and this is actually also what is explained in the article from the OECD. But the problem is that these principles, these goals may contradict each other. And so the main challenge for a functioning system is actually to find a balance between these goals that may contradict each other. For example, competition versus transparency, transparency versus confidentiality, efficiency versus integrity. And so this is the main purpose of the book, actually, how to combine these two principles and being able to have, at the same time, integrity and efficiency. And so the book explores this area and how to balance these goals. But the good thing when you have to comment a book is actually that you can say what you want about the book. And I think that the answers that are provided by these different articles in the book are actually quite different. And they underline the different perspective coming from different legal background and also different legal systems. And I think the answers which have a flavor of continental law, for example, I would say, or common law approach or US approach might be quite different. And so I think this is something I'm also going to mention during this presentation. But as a general solution, I would say that the book, this book advocates for a positive approach of corruption. How can you have a positive approach of corruption? Through the promotion of the integrity principle. Because actually when we think about the principles that govern public procurement, we think about positive principles. We think about transparency. We think about efficiency or competition. Classified as a positive goal. And then we talk about corruption. So it's not actually a very positive way to present the goals of public procurement. So if we advocate for a principle of integrity and not only focusing on corruption, which is a negative aspect of the principle of integrity, we may change the perspective and look for positive solutions and positive way to present this principle. So with this main idea that is the promotion of the integrity principle, which is presented by the book, I think they have explored three areas. The first is the roots of the issue between during the combination of transparency, integrity, and corruption. All these gray zone, these legal gray zone and legal ambiguities that are related with the roots of this issue. And this is actually mentioned in the article written by Gabriela and Roberto Carvalho at the beginning of the book, the article on corruption as a violation of fundamental rights, the reputation risk as a deterrent against the lack of loyalty. And I think it's a very interesting way to explore this issue of enforcing the principle of integrity as a fundamental right and finding a way to promote this fight against corruption as a fight for fundamental rights. So the problem is that actually we are lacking a legal basis for this fundamental right as a principle of integrity as a fundamental right. There was nothing in the EU 2004 procurement directive. There is almost nothing in the 2014. Only about conflict of interest and some about debarment. There is mention about the integrity in case of grave professional misconduct of the contractor. There is a promotion of this principle at international level with the GPA, it's mentioned. and in soft law instruments like the OECD recommendation on the integrity on enhancing integrity. But there is nothing in the French procurement code. It is barely mentioned. There are actually, il y a une décision du Conseil constitutionnel de 2013. I'm switching to French because this is French topic. And, but most of the time it is related with the behavior of the civil servants. That they have to work in an integrity way or perspective, but it's not the system as a whole or the goal that has to be followed by the administration. So violation of the integrity principles, it is also related with the imprecise definition of corruption. And this is also something which is underscored by the book. So one of the merits of the book is actually to help to clarify what is the exact list of offences, offences attached to the award phase of the contract, offences attached to the modification and performance of the contract, and also the distinctions between corruption and collusion. Because most of the time they are quite mixed. I mean, the way that it is presented at international level sometimes is quite confusing. And as soon as you're able to clarify these offenses, then you can jump and look at the sanctions and be able to clarify the sanctions as well. And so the book is exploring the sanctions, but it's not my part. So after this, the exploration of these legal issues and ambiguities of the principle of integrity, the book tries to explore through the different articles, chapters, how to reconciliate efficiency and integrity, because this is the main purpose. And Chris Hukis is actually raising the issue of anti-corruption measures going too far. How far anti-corruption measures can go until they really block the decision process and they really block the efficiency of the process. So he's exploring this through the principal agent theory or the agency theory. I will leave the floor to Chris to explain a little bit more about that. I know he's very fond of this theory. Well, but for example, is there a risk of automatic objective award? If you really go until the end of the logic, then you can go for automatic award and just clicking on the button and you never look at the substance and the analysis of the situations. So all these questions are actually explored through this analysis. There are also several articles about the Italian case. So I know we have several Italian in the room, so I'm not going to go into the details, but actually I want to quote a sentence of Antonio Romano Tasson. Rules of award have deeply changed in the last 30 years. If they were once designed to achieve at their best public interest concerned with the contract, now they have the purpose to prevent a subjective use of the award procedure. So there is a switch in the purpose and the goal of these rules. But what now I want to mention from my exterior point of view is actually, again, the idea that solutions may differ from one country to another depending on the country's situation. And so countries' procurement systems are not working at the same speed. And lessons learned from international comparisons show that developed countries are quite advanced and more sophisticated in their spending policies in comparison with less developed countries. And going deeply, the category of developing countries is not homogeneous so far as well. And so this is a way to introduce actually the third topic which is explored by the book, the idea of discretion. Discretion as an answer, or the way to organize discretion in the process of the choice of the contract. contractor of the management of the contract. And by this organization of the discretion, you may find a way to conciliate the principle of integrity and efficiency. So trying to find some flexibility in the award decision and flexibility in the management of the contract. But again, because it is linked with the legal system of the country, we can understand from the US approach, for example, that you can grant quite a lot of discretion because it's a system where you have accountability which is really enforced and based on the individual accountability of the individual responsibility of the actors of the individual versus our continental approach where it's more collective accountability or collective approach. And it is also underscored in the article on Tunisia, that because we have this idea behind of the faute de service, of the collective fault, default, this is a way to escape the accountability issue and also the sanction mechanism. So, of course, in US we can grant a lot of discretion to the contracting officers and all the individuals involved in the process, because on the back you have a very strong and efficient sanction mechanism, and not only, I'm not just talking about criminal sanctions. And so, while on the other side of the Atlantic we may lack this kind of sanctions. So, I think this is all the philosophy of the system which is different. And I don't want to be too long, and I think I just opened the floor for these reflections, and I hope you very much.
Thank you very much. You absolutely have opened the floor because you gave us so many suggestions and so many interesting points to discuss. And I will try to go on the point that you mentioned. Paul and I have shared the charge to go a little bit deeper in the book, so to just have a look of some specific topics which seems to us particularly interesting. And as for me, I focus my intervention on part 3 of the book, whose title is Corruption and Collusion in Non-Public Contracts. But actually I will focus on bid reading, so on collusion, which is a very interesting point, and I think a very innovative point which has been touched in the book. Well, I will start by quoting something taken by the article of Albert Sanchez Graels. He underlines that the regulation, the idea of the European regulation of public procurement is that there is a genuine and effective competition on the market. That there are many undertakings which are interested in bidding. But this idea, well, can be true, it can happen, but it can happen that it is not true. It can happen that a genuine and effective competition is lacking. And it can be lacking because of the structure of the market. We are facing a concentrated market so that there are not economic operators interested in bidding. But it can also happen because even if there is a sufficient number of economic operators, they adopt collusive practices. They get into agreements, so to reduce competitions. So, in this case, the contracting entity is the victim of the arrangements between economic operators. I don't want to say that they are not responsible. They maybe are responsible. They often are responsible because of their incapacity to organize a sound procedure. Anyhow, face to this risk, it's extremely important, as the book shows, to find a way to reduce the risk, to limit the risk, to prevent collusion. And the book shows that the topic of big rigging requires to face two different problems. The first problem is how to organize the tendering procedure, so to prevent the risk of collision, the risk of big rigging. How an efficient contracting authority should organize the procedure. The second point, I don't know if I will have the time to touch, but if I will have, I will say something. It's how to punish, how to sanction, which kind of sanction we should apply to economic operators who are responsible of these collusive practices. Well, the first point, how to organize a goods public procurement tendering procedure. I think this is a problem of skill and capacity of the contracting authority. So the regulation can do something, but not too much. There are no solutions which are valid everywhere, or which are valid every time. The contracting authority has to find every time the best solution. Every time it has to adapt the procedure to the specific features of the contract that it wants to conclude. And let me emphasize how important are two contributions that you can find in the book. The first one is by Peter McKean, and it's about the importance of, let me quote it exactly, the importance of a professionally educated public procurement workforce. This is a very crucial point. And the other one is the topic of the demand aggregation, because if the problem is the capacity of contracting authorities, we have to concentrate, and Gabriella has written fundamental things to this point, we have to concentrate the tendering procedures in high specialized administrative entities. But let me just try to analyze this point from a theoretical point of view, because I think it's a very complicated issue to approach. It's true that there are different opinions, but in general, I think I can say that the author will be able to say that I'm wrong. But it seems to me that the book shows in a vigorous way, in a very strong way, but the dream to define a model of procedure which is always valid, which is always the same, and which consists of the application of automatic rules is not efficient. I think if we have to take an idea, the general idea is that the automatic procedure is not efficient, and it has to be replaced. And it seems to me that even in this case we have Jeremy can correct me if I'm wrong. This is quite consistent with the recommendation by OECD. And it's interesting to read the article by John Luigi Albano, who says that it's true that the rules of the procedure must be clear. This is a fundamental point of the European policy and the European legislation on public procurement. This is absolutely a pillar of that legislation. But clearness doesn't mean that the rules, the application of the rules must be predictable. The result of the application of the rules shouldn't be predictable to prevent collusion. So, what do we want to say? We want to say that we have to recognize, and I come back to a topic which Laurence has underlined, we must, to be efficient, recognize discretionary powers of contracting authorities. And why? Because we want to create uncertainty. Well, this is quite shocking to me. This sounds quite shocking. And I guess it would seem quite shocking to many classical, traditional administrative professors. It's persuasive as well. Let me get right to the point later on. And I found this extremely interesting how Gabriella and then Gordon compare the European objective approach, let me me use this expression, which is a little bit shorter, the European objective approach with the US subjective one. It seems that a US academic has not problem to say that the awarding choice is a subjective one, is a subjective choice. I can hardly accept that. I mean, it's not that easy for me to accept the idea of the subjectivity of the public entity in the choice. And in the same perspective, Paola Bordalo Faustino in chapter 2 of Part 2 challenges the idea that objectivity, by observing that there is no evidence that lack of discretions corresponds to lack of corruption. And she's probably right. She's probably right. Maybe we can add something more. We can add, as Gabriela has underlined, corruption in the rules. That is, we can have a corruption which brings to adapt the rules to the features, the characteristics of a specific undertakings, so that when we apply the rules, that undertaking will be preferred. This is very dangerous, and I can say, because I'm Italian, this is very dangerous because it's quite easy for a civil servant just to hide corruption by saying that the procedure has an automatic nature. So, the book proposed with energy the need for overcoming the idea of objectivity. And as I told you before, it seems to me that it does so in a very convincing way. I was not convinced before. I was extremely doubtful. But I have to say that there are many persuasive arguments for sustaining a Lacking hypothesis. But let me just say that some problems arise. First, let me be traditional just a little bit. I'm not modern now. In which limits, according to the fundamental principle of European countries, this uncertainty is acceptable. As Italian, I would say that they are quite inconsistent. The idea of the unpredictability is quite inconsistent with the rule of law. I mean, I would have problems. I have to think about it. I think we can find a theoretical explication, but really we have to change completely the perspective. We have to think of the regulation of public procurement in a totally different way. Our second point, how to move from an objective system to a subjective system, which is the path that we have to follow. Because it's not. I mean, it's dangerous. It's an enormous change. And I would like to quote Peter McKinnon again. Which is the expression that you have used today? A robust system of which was a robust system of oversight. A robust system of, it's a brilliant expression. A robust system of oversight. And I think that increasing the space for discretion can be maybe a good direction, but it requires caution. We can open the system to a wider discretion and move towards a more flexible model if in the meanwhile we work on the conflict of interest, on the quality of public servants, and on the liability of public servants who make mistakes, who cause damages, who are corrupted. And from this point of view, I want also, as Laurence Arjafet mentioned the importance of the chapter by Gabriela Racca and Roberto Cavallo Perin about three crucial aspects. First one, the ethic of public service. Second, the social sanction against the lack of loyalty and against the corruption of civil servants. Third, the capacity of an economic system to exclude the undertakings which act in an illegal way. There are three necessary conditions for starting to think to a different system. Just a few words about the second point, if I can, just few minutes. The other side of the problems is how to punish undertakings which are involved in bid breaking. And this instead is a directly juridical problem. In this case, we have to find a juridical solution. And the book shows how strong is the need for an integration between the regulation of public procurement and the antitrust regulation. The bid rigging cannot be sanctioned only by antitrust sanctions or by the criminal judge. This is not efficient. This can be correct, but it is not enough. The collusion must be considered as a problem of public procurement. So it must be sanctioned by rules which are directed to protect the integrity of the contract. And the new directives consider specifically the bid breaking in Article 57 as a clause of exclusion. Nevertheless, it does not give a definition of what a bid breaking is. And this is not a secondary problem, it is a great problem. Let me just give you an example. What happens if two undertakings try to get into an agreement but they do not succeed? What happens? Or what happens if they get into the agreement but the agreement doesn't give the result, so doesn't interfere in the choice? Are we sure that this kind of behavior are, let's say, irrelevant, are not relevant, and doesn't deserve to be sanctioned? I leave the question aside and don't have time for going further in the discussion. Second problem, how to detect the existence of a collusion between undertakings. And the book suggests many different solutions which are extremely interesting. I think one important point is touched by Patricia Valcárcel and Antonio Lopez Migno, which suggested that it is necessary to have experts in the commission. The commission in charge of the work decision must be composed by people who are expert in detecting collusion. And this is a crucial point. Maybe we can add something more. We can say also that there is a specific obligation for commissions to evaluate the existence of a collusive practice and to declare under their responsibility that they didn't find any evidence of collusion. So to just underline their responsibility, just to oblige to take an express position about this point, which is so important in economical terms. And guidelines on methodology would be extremely important, as it would be also important to have a codified list of warning signs, as OECD in its recommendation of 2012 has already done. This kind of things, a list of warning signs and a methodology which is efficient can make this kind of obligation stricter and its accomplishment more successful. We should also consider the possibility to define in an objective way some behaviors which shouldn't be admitted, because usually they are expression of collusion, or because in any case they bring negative results. For instance, are we sure that we should accept joint tenders by undertakings when each undertaking has the requirements for proposing a single offer isn't this a way to open the door to collusion? Isn't this the way to allow a sort of an abuse of the right? But I have to stop because my time is going to end, and I could carry on a lot. Let me just say that there are many other things which would deserve to be discussed, and this is my conclusion. There are many things to discuss. This book is full of things, full of elements, full of suggestions. It offers a clear point of view. I don't want to say that everything is shareable, but I mean, there are many things, a clear point of view, and the indication of practical solutions. So, thank you very much for your great job and for giving us this great opportunity to reflect on some important topics. And at this point,
Thank you very much, Simon. As already been said, I will try translation in French. Donc, si vous êtes d'accord, je vais passer au français pour éviter de répéter ce qui a été dit. Ceci dit, comme le disait Laurence, quand on commente un livre, on peut dire ce que l'on veut. Moi, je vais le présenter avec un regard très subjectif. C'est comment, donc, moi, en tant qu'avocat français, j'ai réagi par rapport à ce livre. La première chose que je voulais dire, c'est qu'en France, quand j'ai commencé ma carrière il y a quelques années, les marchés publics dans les entreprises et dans les administrations étaient gérés de façon quasi exclusive par des ingénieurs. Donc ce n'étaient pas des commerciaux, ce n'étaient pas des spécialistes de la finance et du commerce, encore moins des juristes, mais c'était des ingénieurs. C'était vrai dans les administrations, et ça reste d'ailleurs en grande partie vrai, et c'était vrai, ça reste encore en grande partie vrai dans certaines entreprises, par exemple, les entreprises dans le secteur de la défense, une entreprise comme Thales, la plupart des marchés publics restent gérés à l'heure actuelle par des ingénieurs. Donc, il existait en France des procédures. Oui, il existait des procédures, il existait de multiples procédures, il existait de multiples procédures complexes, il existait beaucoup de process, mais il n'existait pas vraiment de droit des marchés publics. Donc il y avait des procédures de marché public, mais il n'existait pas vraiment de droit des marchés publics. Et d'ailleurs, à l'université, il y a finalement assez peu de spécialistes français de droit des marchés publics, il y a assez peu de livres de droit des marchés publics français, et je n'ai pas noté qu'il y avait beaucoup d'auteurs français dans ce livre également. Donc ce livre, déjà, de ce point de vue, est venu enrichir notre réflexion et notre boîte à outils pour nous, je dis avocats du droit français. Le deuxième point de mon introduction, c'est que le droit des marchés publics a été, là encore en France, toujours traditionnellement considéré comme étant un droit très national. Et puis, il y a 10 ans, tout a basculé. Le droit des marchés publics, qui était considéré comme une spécificité nationale, est devenu communautaire. Et on avait même un ministre de l'économie, les Français s'en souviennent, qui avait dit, quand il avait transposé les directives européennes, il avait dit tout le droit communautaire et rien que le droit communautaire. Autrement dit, toute spécificité nationale du droit des marchés publics devait disparaître et le droit français ne devait faire que calquer, que répliquer le droit communautaire. Donc, un droit très national, voire quasiment exclusivement national, nous avons eu tendance à passer à un droit exclusivement communautaire. Et ce livre apporte une richesse, et ça, pour moi, c'est une richesse qui était inédite avant que je lise ce livre, c'est cette approche comparatiste. Et effectivement, quand le projet a été proposé il y a quelques années, j'étais un peu sceptique, moi, sur le projet, et c'est peut-être pour ça d'ailleurs que je n'ai pas contribué, en vérité, c'est que je pensais que nous n'allions faire que répéter ce que disait l'OCDE, ce que disait la Banque mondiale, ce que disait la Commission européenne sur le marché public. Et je n'avais pas perçu la richesse de l'approche comparatiste. Donc j'ai retenu moi trois idées fondamentales pour préciser le déroulé de mon raisonnement. La première idée, c'est que, à nouveau de mon point de vue, les sujets de corruption sont des sujets qui sont, je dirais, en grande partie résolus, dans ma pratique en tout cas, dans ce que je vois tous les jours. Le sujet de corruption n'est plus vraiment à l'ordre du jour des juristes dans les marchés publics en France. C'est parfois dans les médias, mais le sujet a une importance très relative, actuellement en tout cas en France. Deuxièmement, il n'en reste pas moins que les marchés publics subissent des influences insidieuses, des influences indirectes qui menacent l'intégrité et l'efficience. Et ça, c'est toujours d'actualité en France. Et le troisième point, c'est que, et ça vous le dites, Christopher et Gabriel, dans votre introduction, vous dites que la loi ne suffit pas. Alors, c'est quelque chose aussi très nouveau pour les juristes français, en particulier les juristes français spécialisés de droit public, qui sont souvent positivistes, c'est-à-dire que finalement positiviste, c'est quelqu'un qui répète et qui traduit et qui essaie d'expliquer la loi. C'est quelque chose de nouveau que de dire tout n'est pas dans la loi et la loi ne suffit pas. Alors dans ce livre, sans doute parce que les rédacteurs n'ont pas été contaminés par cette tendance française, vous nous expliquez que le droit, et donc que le rôle des juristes, ne se limite pas à expliquer la loi, qu'elle soit nationale ou européenne. Vous nous expliquez que, il y a d'autres, que le droit ne se résume pas à la loi. Vous nous expliquez, vous nous parlez de formation, vous nous parlez de soft law, vous nous parlez de la vigilance, de la nécessaire vigilance de la société civile avec des systèmes d'alerte. Vous nous parlez des protocoles de légalité, vous nous parlez de tous ces sujets qui, quelque part, dépassent le droit, ou dépassent la loi, pardon, mais qui restent du domaine des juristes. Et vous le faites sans passer le relais à des non-juristes, c'est-à-dire que vous gardez la parole sur des sujets qui étendent le droit au-delà de la loi. Ça, c'est aussi quelque chose de nouveau. Je regrette de le dire, mais c'est vrai que c'est quelque chose de nouveau, en tout cas pour les juristes français qui font des marchés publics. Alors, pour commencer sur la corruption, je vous disais que la corruption n'était pas forcément un sujet d'actualité en France. Il est vrai que des chiffres sont cités de l'OCDE, de la Commission européenne, qui expliquent, en affichant des milliards, le coût de la corruption en Europe. Alors, je suis toujours très sceptique sur ces moyennes, parce que des moyennes européennes, alors que les situations sont très différenciées, la moyenne finalement ne signifie pas grand-chose. Si on doit définir des comportements, si on doit définir un droit, si on doit définir des actions avec des moyennes européennes, ces actions, ce droit, ne seront nécessairement pas adaptées aux spécificités de chacun des pays. C'est ce que tu disais. Donc, effectivement, il y a des écarts, il faut le dire, absolument énormes entre les pays membres de l'Union européenne en matière de corruption. Alors, je ne sais pas si on peut les chiffrer, mais les rapports n'ont absolument rien à voir. Il existe des pays dans lesquels la plupart des marchés publics sont contaminés par la corruption. Il existe des pays dans lesquels la corruption est anecdotique. Donc je pense que les moyennes, au niveau européen, n'ont véritablement aucun sens. En France, la corruption a été véritablement éradiquée, supprimée, en tout cas est devenue anecdotique. Elle était très importante dans les années 90, il y a 20 ans. On citait il y a 20 ans une règle, c'était la règle de monsieur, je ne me rappellerai pas le nom, et il avait défini comme règle au niveau de l'Île-de-France, de la région Île-de-France, que les 6 plus grandes entreprises de construction françaises devaient bénéficier des 2 tiers des marchés publics. Et naturellement, après, ils percevaient des commissions pour financer le Parti conservateur. C'était dans les années 90, c'est donc assez récent. Mais suite à ça, et suite à ce scandale-là, en particulier en France, il y a eu des lois en 91, en 92, en 93, des lois relatives à la transparence, relatives à la prévention de la corruption dans les marchés publics, et puis finalement une règle pénale très dure qui a été adoptée, qui, en simplifiant à l'extrême, permet de sanctionner pénalement, avec 2 ans d'emprisonnement et 30 000 € d'amende, toute personne qui apporterait un avantage à un soumissionnaire dans un marché public, dès lors qu'il commettrait un acte contraire à une procédures législatives ou réglementaires relatives au marché public. C'est-à-dire tout non-respect d'une règle législative ou réglementaire liée au marché public peut entraîner cette sanction pénale. Donc la définition du délit est extrêmement brutale et extrêmement radicale. Donc en effet, suite à cela, il est vrai que la corruption a véritablement chuté. Et actuellement, on compte en France par an environ, d'après les statistiques, entre 25 et 40 affaires de corruption par an. Donc sur quoi les chiffres de la Commission européenne ne sont absolument pas transposables, en tout cas, dans notre cas. Donc quelque part, le non-respect du Code des marchés publics en France est beaucoup moins inquiétant et beaucoup moins préoccupant que le non-respect du Code de la route, par exemple. Le non-respect du Code de la route, c'est 7 morts. Le non-respect du Code des marchés publics, c'est 40 ou 50 infractions par an. Donc c'est totalement disproportionné de continuer à se focaliser sur ce sujet, à mon sens, en France. Alors ceci dit, comme je vous le disais, il existe encore en matière de marché public des dérives insidieuses, des dérives indirectes qui menacent donc l'intégrité et l'efficience. Le manque d'intégrité, alors Gabriela, tu le soulignes dans la partie 4 au chapitre 1, à un moment donné tu cites la question des conflits d'intérêts qui peuvent affecter la définition des avenants. Alors ça c'est très intéressant parce qu'on voit bien que c'est indirect, que c'est insidieux, qu'on n'est pas dans la corruption évidente. Le conflit d'intérêt, parce que le fonctionnaire peut avoir un conflit d'intérêt, il peut avoir tendance à influencer les avenants, donc les modifications du marché. On peut également citer l'influence du lobbying, dès lors que le lobbying n'est pas transparent, n'est pas défini, n'est pas contrôlé, on a là une influence qui est insidieuse, qui est indirecte. Sur l'efficacité, alors Peter McQueen, vous le citez, vous citez aussi les contradictions apparentes, en tout cas entre les différents objectifs, c'est la partie 5, chapitre 1, les contradictions entre les différents objectifs, entre l'intégrité et la transparence, le prix, l'impact sanitaire et social, et comment peut-on parvenir à harmoniser ces différentes tendances et ces différents objectifs contradictoires. Et puis sur l'efficacité, il faut rappeler, moi je peux vous faire part de 2 témoignages qui sont frappants parce que ce sont des choses qui sont nécessairement vraies parce que je les ai entendues de la part de clients. Un client me disait récemment, à propos d'une entreprise qui va être privatisée, il me disait si cette entreprise est privatisée, elle ne sera plus soumise au marché public, et donc le coût du procurement, le coût d'achat, va être réduit automatiquement de 20%. De 20%. Le seul fait de ne pas soumettre cette entreprise au Code des marchés publics va réduire le coût de 20%. Il était prêt à s'engager, puisque lui-même était un acheteur potentiel de l'entreprise, il était prêt à s'engager dans un contrat avec l'État sur ce sujet. Donc ce n'était pas des propos commerciaux, c'était des propos qui engageaient une entreprise donc rationnelle, un acteur économique rationnel qui disait « moi je fais baisser les coûts de 20% dès lors que je n'applique pas le marché public ». Ça laisse effectivement penser qu'il y a encore des efforts à faire du côté de l'efficience. Un autre exemple, c'est un exemple que j'ai vécu hier, c'est pour ça que je voulais vous le citer parce qu'il est anecdotique, mais il est amusant. Hier, l'État français m'a demandé une question sur justement le Code des marchés publics. Faut-il ou pas appliquer le Code des marchés publics à telle situation? Et pour me poser cette question, l'État doit passer un marché public, naturellement. Et donc l'État a interrogé un certain nombre de cabinets d'avocats par une procédure particulière, puisque j'ai dû remplir 56 pages, déjà là. 56 pages. Donc 5 cabinets d'avocats ont été interrogés, 56 pages. Je n'ai pas pu faire ça par mail, il a fallu envoyer un porteur qui a déposé 5 exemplaires signés. Et le montant du marché est absolument ridicule, puisqu'il me faudrait gagner 300 appels d'offres comme ça par an pour réaliser mes objectifs, les objectifs de chiffre d'affaires que me fixe le cabinet. Donc je devrais non seulement répondre 300 fois, mais faire 300 fois la prestation et gagner 300 fois. Donc on voit bien que pour des montants qui sont, je pouvais le croire, extrêmement faibles, voilà le type de procédure auquel elle aboutit. Alors pourquoi parvient-on à ces extrêmes en France? Je pense que c'est lié à l'inadéquation des sanctions par rapport aux maux, aux problèmes qui sont constatés. Et ça me ramène au problème pénal que je citais. Je vous le disais, la règle pénale est extrêmement stricte et donc les comportements des fonctionnaires sont extrêmement adverses au risque, ils craignent le risque, et donc se protègent par des actes bureaucratiques qui, pour le coup, sont totalement inefficients. Alors, je voulais citer sur le manque d'intégrité et d'efficacité, je voulais faire un parallèle avec les affaires de discrimination. Les affaires de discrimination sexuelle, politique, raciale ou religieuse. Pourquoi je fais cette analogie? Pourquoi je fais ce parallèle? Parce que de la même façon, pour ces questions de discrimination sexuelle, politique, raciale ou religieuse, pour mettre fin à ce type de comportement, le législateur avait adopté une sanction pénale extrêmement stricte, tout propos, tout acte qui affecterait, qui porterait atteinte, qui créerait des discriminations sexuelles, politiques, raciales ou religieuses, peut être condamné pénalement. C'est un peu comme pour les marchés publics, une sanction pénale extrêmement générale qui a été définie. Alors effectivement, en tout cas en France, dans certains milieux, ces comportements ont explicitement disparu. Un peu comme pour les marchés publics, je continue l'analogie, la corruption a largement diminué, quasiment disparu. Donc on voit bien que les comportements les plus évidents en atteinte, qui portaient atteinte de façon la plus évidente aux discriminations, ont été réduits, en tout cas considérablement, de par l'adoption de cette loi. Mais, et je continue l'analogie avec les marchés publics, il n'en reste pas moins qu'en matière de discrimination, il existe toujours des discriminations indirectes, des discriminations insidieuses. Alors deux exemples, en France, 50% des homosexuels qui sont actifs dans le marché du travail considèrent que le seul fait de déclarer leur homosexualité leur portera atteinte à leur carrière. Donc on voit bien qu'il y a des discriminations encore très insidieuses. Donc non sanctionnables directement par l'article du code pénal que j'ai cité, mais il n'en reste pas moins que ces discriminations continuent à exister sous des formes beaucoup plus insidieuses. Même sujet pour les discriminations concernant le sexe, puisque le principal critère de discrimination dans le monde professionnel a été considéré comme étant le sexe et la maternité et la grossesse. C'est actuellement en France le principal critère de discrimination. Donc on voit bien que malgré l'édiction de sanctions très fortes, les comportements les plus évidents ont disparu, mais il n'en reste pas moins que ces tendances insidieuses, ces tendances indirectes continuent à exister. Alors comment régler ces problèmes? Pour les discriminations, on voit bien que la loi dure, la loi pénale ne suffit pas, il faut passer par des mécanismes plus de conviction, de soft law, plus adaptés au mal qui est constaté actuellement, qui n'est pas le même, le problème d'aujourd'hui n'est pas le même, n'est pas celui qui était posé hier, donc le remède doit être naturellement différent. Alors dernière chose, est-ce qu'on peut considérer que le fait que la corruption ait été largement diminuée ou supprimée et qu'il existe encore des atteintes à l'intégrité et l'efficience, peut-on considérer que c'est moins grave? Peut-on considérer que la corruption était quelque chose de beaucoup plus grave? Peut-être, mais à la fin, je dirais, de la même façon que pour les discriminations sexuelles ou religieuses, à la fin, qu'il y ait corruption ou qu'il y ait une atteinte à l'intégrité ou à l'efficience, mais à la fin, c'est toujours le même qui paie. La victime est toujours la même. Là, c'est le contribuable. Dans l'autre cas, c'est la personne discriminée. Et le bénéficiaire est toujours le même. Donc on voit bien que, quand bien même les moyens utilisés sont différents, le résultat est quelque part le même. Donc je considère que les atteintes à l'intégrité et à l'efficience sont quelque part aussi graves, bien qu'ils empruntent des chemins différents, mais sont quelque part aussi graves que ne l'était hier la corruption. Alors, ce que j'ai beaucoup aimé dans ce livre, c'est que, justement, vous déclinez, c'est là la richesse de l'approche comparatiste, vous déclinez les différentes situations dans les différents pays, et on voit bien la diversité des outils qui sont à la disposition, et pas simplement à nouveau des outils législatifs, encore au moins uniquement des outils relatifs au droit pénal, des outils législatifs, mais également des outils issus du droit en général, y compris de la soft law. Donc, on a des exposés très intéressants sur les conflits d'intérêts dans la procédure administrative italienne. Dans la procédure roumaine aussi, il y a un exposé très intéressant sur le conflit d'intérêts, la notion de conflit d'intérêts qui est intégrée dans les marchés publics. Des développements naturellement sur les conflits d'intérêts dans les nouvelles directives communautaires relatives aux marchés publics. Et puis à nouveau, des développements sur les codes de conduite, puisque j'ai aimé la partie 5 du chapitre 3, où on voit qu'aux États-Unis, 78% des 1000 plus grandes organisations professionnelles ont adopté des codes de conduite, 65% des plus grandes organisations professionnelles en Espagne et 38% des 100 plus grandes aux Pays-Bas. Donc c'est très intéressant de voir à quel point ce type de code de conduite s'adapte. Donc moi, pour conclure, je ne veux pas abuser du temps qui m'est imparti, merci, mais pour conclure, je voudrais revenir sur la richesse de l'approche comparatiste et cette idée selon laquelle nous avons en Europe, et nous avons aussi dans le temps, et je vais citer à travers l'exemple français, nous avons dans l'histoire et dans la géographie finalement, des situations différentes auxquelles il faut apporter des remèdes différents, auxquels il faut trouver des solutions différentes. Et donc, depuis le pénal, qui est la sanction la plus grave, en passant par la loi, et puis la soft law et la formation, on voit dans ce livre la richesse de l'éventail possible. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Merci. Qui vous démontre quelque chose de très important. Il vous démontre que les mots corruption est un mot qui n'est pas suffisant pour décrire les problèmes. Et vraiment, dans le livre, on parle de beaucoup de choses de la corruption. Et qui parler de la corruption est quelque chose qui peut être une manière de limiter et de ne pas être capable de faire face aux problèmes qui le marché public, la réputation du marché public pose. C'est vraiment c'est quelque chose qu'il faut considérer de manière très attentive. Alors, on a beaucoup de choses sur la table et peut-être il y a quelqu'un qui veut intervenir, dire quelque chose. Is there anyone who has something to say, some comments?
Les auteurs qui veulent réagir, les auteurs entendus.
I can just thank you all for this nice presentation and all these comments, and also the possibility, the chance of going on and going deeper in this study, because as you mentioned, integrity is a wide concept. We try to put it in a positive way to speak of integrity, not of corruption, and also to define rules of administrative law to fight corruption and not of criminal law, obviously. Then all the things you said are really, really interesting, and I look forward to receiving other comments on these works, because we really, I can speak also for Chris, it's a work in which we included our passion and our also efforts in fighting corruption. As we feel that maybe we are not as lucky as in France, but the problem in Italy is really, really widespread and also in many other countries. So facing it with also new perspective and new instruments and comparing all the best solution and best practice that we can find is really a challenge for us. And so thank you very much for your comments. And I will to Chris comment.
Sure, we can throw some ideas up there. The title is, in Europe, do you have a game where you throw words up in the refrigerator with magnets and you move them around into poetry?
We have a refrigerator.
Yeah. we had 3 words: integrity, efficiency, and sustainability. We had to put together into a title because we had so many different topics we wanted to pull together. So one of the things that became clear to us as we were working on the project was that what we really wanted to do was try to set the basis for future research by other academics. We really wanted to try to push the pieces in that direction. To the extent that we were adding annotations, adding sources, we really wanted to lay the groundwork for future research. Laurence is very correct. I'm very fond of the principal agent theory, and we're just talking about that because it's a good starting point for possible research topics. Also, the whole issue of corruption. So there's a difference with American academics. American academics, as a professor of law in the United States, I have to serve as a role model for lawyers who are going to go right out, and there's no buffer zone, because our law students are a little bit older than your law students. There's no practical buffer zone. The next day they might be practicing, they might be in a criminal court. So I have to be a role model for these young people who are going to go out and make some very hard decisions right away as lawyers. So it helps that I have some practical experience. And so I've represented people who have been corrupt in their lives. And I have to say, corruption is amazingly banal when you actually encounter it. The difference between what's corruption and what's not corruption is if you're paying for dinner for the contracting officer versus not paying for dinner for the contracting officer. The dinner's going to take place one way or the other. That's what contractors do. Contractors have dinner with contracting officers. That happens regularly. The question is whether or not dinner's going to be paid for, how dinner's going to be paid for. So when you start to see that the line between what's corruption and what's not corruption is so vague in actuality, when you're talking about pure corruption, things like bribery or gratuity, and you start to think, well, maybe it's a much bigger concept overall, which is why I like to use the principal agent concept. It also is a starting point for recognizing where there's more research and also where there's failures in our model. So the principal agent model is that the principal has a goal, the principal wants to buy something, and we in our personal lives don't hire agents, but we do hire agents when we're governments. We hire a contracting official, and that contracting official in turn hires a contractor, and they accomplish the goal. And the contractor, both the contractor and the contracting official have what are called by the economists, and this is all theory going back to the 1970s, they have conflicts of interest that cause them to diverge from the principal's goals. The reason we don't hire agents in our personal lives when we buy a car is because we're afraid the agent will make a mistake. We don't do it in our personal lives, but governments always do it. And I go from country to country to country, and always governments do this. So why do they always do it? It's because we don't really know who the principal is. The principal is defined in different cultures in different ways. In Brazil, when you ask them who the principal is, they say instantaneously it's the people. The people are the principal because they have a left-leaning government that's been in place for a long time, and that's been something that they've assimilated, the idea that the principal is the people. The purest form of the principal being only one person in modern times was Adolf Hitler during the Third Reich. If you look at the last days of the Third Reich, 1944, 1945, it became very clear that the Third Reich was about one man, about Adolf Hitler. And in fact, once he died, the Third Reich collapsed within a few days, arguably because everyone's mindset was that way in Germany at that point. So there you had a very interesting modern example of a one-person principal. But usually we have multiple principals, and so we don't know who the real principal is. We have to delegate authority to a contracting official, and that creates the pathology of agency. The principal-agent problem is that the agent always diverges. The agent might diverge because of corruption, because he receives a bribe, or the agent might diverge because he's lazy or he doesn't care. And this is where you begin to get different issues, areas for possible research that pile into this. So, for example, when I talk about this theory with our colleague at the University of Lagos, Shofe Williams-Alegbe, she is in a land which has hyper-corruption. Nigeria has hyper-corruption. Well, those of you who haven't been to Nigeria, it's very interesting to go. They're on the sides of the houses, it says, this house is not for sale, because when you go on holiday, your neighbor will sell your house while you're away on holiday. Completely crazy. And I was robbed at gunpoint in Nigeria. I give you a broad discussion of exactly how bad it is. Imagine being robbed at gunpoint and not being able to go to the police because the police will kill you because they want to stop the investigation because they'll be paid by the criminal. It's completely crazy. So in the land of hyper-corruption, Shofe, who's a very good friend, she works incredibly hard in her field. She wrote, by the way, one of the most interesting books on debarment, comparative peace and debarment. She says the principal agent theory doesn't work in a place like Nigeria because in hyper-corruption, you have the principals all being corrupt as well. And those of you who teach students from Nigeria, you know this. Students from Nigeria, when I have them in my class, we talk about corruption issues. They say, Professor, how can, these are typically people who are already working, they say, how can I be clean when my boss is corrupt too? So if I do the right thing, my boss will yell at me. And if he does the right thing, his boss will yell at him. The whole thing is corrupt all the way through. And they say, well, you've left me with no choice here. And my response is, as an American, our tradition is if you don't like it, leave. I actually left where I grew up in Massachusetts, which is a corrupt area. I moved to Washington because I did not want to spend my life in a time of corruption. Americans just leave. That's sort of our overly facile response. Chopin's response is a different one, which is her response is one of collective action. And that's an area that is not something we've looked at as an academic community, which is how can collective action begin to work to solve the problem. She says that when you go, if you look at the materials that come out, for example, out of the UN about corruption, it's all posters that young people put on the wall. And they write out their Twitter things, and they have these Facebook things about how awful corruption is. What that is collective action. It's to get people to move against corruption collectively. Say, well, that's kind of cool. That's a political movement. That is an academic thing. It's an academic thing because we can begin to connect dots. I, as a professor, have been teaching ethics and compliance for years. In America, you teach compliance systems on how corporations set up compliance systems, and they always say, oh, you have to teach ethics at the same time. You teach ethics too about and when a CEO, that's what the CEO does. He says, we have to be a clean corporation. Well, I always thought, man, it's kind of a pain. I have to teach both, but okay, as a matter of formal requirement, I'll teach both. What Chopin has done is by pointing out that collective action is important, she's explained why we teach ethics and compliance. Because ethics is a form of collective action within corporations. She's basically opened an entire window in terms of understanding what corporations are doing. She says, because what ethics is, it is a form of collective action. It's a way of getting people within the corporation who might otherwise be in a situation like Nigeria, which is hyper-corruption. It's a way of moving them, using norms to move them in the right direction, whereas pure rules aren't enough. So very interesting issue coming out of a failure, of an apparent failure of the principal agent, looking at the issue of collective action. So the principal agent model is also all about asymmetries in information, that if an agent has more information than a principal, then the agent is going to be able to take advantage of the principal. And that takes us into issues of conflict of interest and dividing between personal conflicts of interest versus organizational conflicts of interest that Peter talked about this morning. Organizational conflicts of interest is when a corporation writes its own specifications. Personal conflict of interest is when I get a bribe. Why do we punish personal conflict of interest more severely than we punish organizational conflict of interest? And I think the reason is the way that we keep the principle keeps people in line is by monitoring them or sanctioning them. We sanction contracting officials who get bribes as opposed to, we don't really sanction corporations that have organizational conflicts of interest because the bribe is always secret and you can't monitor it. So the monitoring that the principal agent process tells us about explains why we have to punish bribes so severely, because there's no monitoring. So that's an interesting academic question, why we divide the two. Another question is, how do we deal with cultural differences? I was talking to 25 contracting officials from Botswana, and I was trying to talk to them a little bit about how we deal with issues of corruption. This is on Monday this week. And they said, do we really have ethical people in the world? Do they really exist? They were kind of challenging me as the American who doesn't know anything. I said, I actually went to your country. When I was 15 years old, I worked in your country. I worked in the hospital in the capital, and I got to do eye exams with my dad, who's an eye doctor. I did eye exams of prisoners. And the prisoners would come in these big carts that are about half the size of this room, and they were pulled by a tractor. And the prisoners would sit on the back of the tractor, back of the carts, and they all come in, and then they get off, and I would do the eye exam with them, north, south, east, or west. And then they would go in and see my dad, and they'd come back out, they'd all get back on the cart, and they'd be pulled back to their prisons. And I said, in America, if that happened, if you put all the prisoners on a cart, they would all just run away. But in Botswana, they stay on the back of the cart. They don't run away. Why is that? It's because you have a society, a small society. Governor owners from the capital of Botswana has only 165,000 people. A small place. Monitoring is much more intense. And actually, the sanctioning goes on back in the villages. If you steal a cow, the village will beat you. And then they'll send you for punishment to the capital. You spend time in prison in the capital. But really, your punishment occurs in the village. They'll beat you with sticks, and then they'll turn their back on you. And that's the real punishment. It's a different sanctioning system. So the academic question here is sanctioning systems that change from culture to culture. Why is it that we see different sanctioning systems working different in different cultural contexts? This gets to the issue that Peter was raising in terms of capacity development. Peter was talking about capacity development in the U.S. procurement system. We have 200,000 civil servants who have to be trained. How do we train them? We might say, well, this is an issue of education. No, if we were in a developing nation, if we parachuted in Botswana or we parachuted in Ghana, we wouldn't say this is an issue of academic education. We'd say this is an issue of capacity development. There's an enormous amount of literature on capacity development that has not been integrated into procurement literature. Nobody in this field has ever looked at the question of capacity development. Lots of literature on the development side that would make us really effective at capacity development if we knew how to do it, and also would begin to raise really interesting questions about the way we teach procurement. Because if we're going to say, if I go to Botswana and I have to follow a checklist, a menu on how I do training in Botswana so I do good capacity development, doesn't that mean that I should do the same thing back home when I'm thinking about educating students myself? That runs into things like, how do you make sure that when you get to Botswana, you actually understand their local political structure so that you're educating meaningfully into the local political structure? It makes us think in very different terms as professors about how we think about our jobs. And that gets to the last couple things that I want to talk about with you this afternoon, about what I want to get out of this structure. This is something I talked about with Jean Bernard a couple of years ago. He was a little bit surprised when I raised it. I want this group to be a politically active group. I want this group to be able to make comments on how regulation is unfolding. And that's a very important thing right now under TTIP. We talked about this in Budapest as well. Under the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, there is a discussion about how we deal with procurement. Because in part, I'm convinced, you want to shut off the video for a second, I'm convinced because the American negotiator doesn't really know procurement that well. He does not want to be aggressive about what position the United States takes on procurement. He's a young guy who's trying to learn his way. And he doesn't want to make procurement like other regulatory subjects under TTIP, agriculture, drugs. All these other areas will be the subject of ongoing negotiation and cooperation between the United States and Europe if TTIP succeeds. Why isn't procurement in that list? Why won't we have ongoing negotiations between the United States and Europe to discuss stupid differences in our law? Why do we call it FAR Part 15 and you call it competitive dialogue? Why do you call it open tendering and we call it sealed bidding when it's fundamentally the same thing? Why are there subtle differences? Here's another question for you. Why is it that the white-collar lawyers, when the compliance systems were being put together in the United Kingdom in 2010, 2011, they wrote compliance standards between 2010 and 2011 that look exactly like the American standards? Why can they harmonize and we can't harmonize as procurement people? Because we really haven't pushed it. That's the answer. What's necessary to make this work is for people who care about procurement on both sides of the Atlantic to be talking to each other during the regulatory process. If you wanted to know how to affect the American regulatory process, so the American regulations look enough like the European regulations so there aren't stupid barriers to entry for European exporters coming into the American market, I can tell you about that. I can tell you what the key regulations are going to be that are coming down the pike every year. I can tell you how to make comments on that. I can tell you who to talk to in Washington. I need somebody in Europe to do the same thing. I need you as Europeans to tell me whom to speak to, whom I should speak to, whom you should speak to make the European procurement regulatory structure enough like the American regulatory structure so there aren't stupid differences. There are always going to be differences because the culture, the viewpoint, the history are so different between the two countries, which is between the European Union and between the United States, and that's fine. But sometimes there are unnecessary differences just because people aren't talking to each other. Eventually, as this forum keeps going and gets more sophisticated and moves, for example, to an electronic structure where we might have a blog that's supported by this forum, that becomes a vehicle for the type of communication that allows the two systems to cooperate with each other. I know that this is a wacko American idea. American professors, we view ourselves as agents of social change. That's a big part of our job. We do. We cherry pick issues and we view it as part of our job to make the system work better. And people actually leave us alone. They allow us to do that because that's part of our job and that's okay. So we have a very different role in society than many professors in many other countries. I know that and I respect that. But from an American perspective, I can tell you, we're ready to move on this issue. When you're ready, let me know.
So, actually, I think there are differences between European countries, as you mentioned. In some countries, lawyers and academic lawyers will participate in the public debate on these issues. In other countries, it will remain in the academic sphere. That will be the case in France, for example. Your ideas are very good. Of course, they surprised me a bit 2 years ago. I just wonder how to do that exactly.
Well, for instance, right now we're writing laws and rules in cybersecurity. To have a log entry where we compare what the two sides are doing in cybersecurity, that would be very, very useful. Both, it would be interesting from industry, because industry would look over our shoulders to see what's going on. But it would also be very, very, very useful in terms of harmonizing the approaches. Germany has right now a no spy decree, which says that a contractor can't sell to Germany if it appears that that contractor may give up the data to a third-party spy organization like NSA. It's really an anti-NSA rule. That's an interesting cybersecurity rule, but it's nowhere near the depth and completeness of the U.S. cybersecurity rules. In some cases, you might want to copy what the U.S. is doing, because the U.S. is struggling through many of the same issues. Or vice versa. We don't have a rule regarding reverse auctions. We've completely screwed up reverse auctions in the U.S. We could very much borrow from the Europeans. I'll be glad.
It's quite scary now. Are you ready to let you know that?
Yeah, to read the book.
Yeah.
First, read the book, and also maybe another session.
Donc, alors, c'était prévu effectivement après cette présentation de cet ouvrage, que je pense que ceux qui n'ont pas lu maintenant ont envie de lire. On avait prévu de parler un peu de la prochaine ouvrage. Je ne sais pas si on a encore le temps ou si on veut faire quelque chose peut-être par email. Parce que comme
Moi, je suggère qu'on en discute un petit peu. C'était ce qui était prévu normalement au début de l'après-midi. On l'a basculé là maintenant de façon à ne pas trop déranger l'agenda, notamment des gens qui sont venus juste pour cette discussion. Fait qu'on peut peut-être faire un tout petit break pour laisser ceux qui ne sont pas partie prenante de cet ouvrage la possibilité de partir. Et en revanche, ceux qui ont prévu de contribuer à l'ouvrage sur le contentieux, de rester pour la discussion. Okay. I think now we want to discuss about the book, next book, on contractual litigations and protest mechanisms. So the issue is if you want to participate in the book or the issue, and if you have time to, you can stay and we have discussions. Otherwise, if you do not participate in the book or do not have time, you can leave, maybe. And so, because it's already 6, and we know that we are late, so we don't want to push everybody. So I don't know